The Mystery of the Cupboard by Lynne Reid Banks. Chapter 14, The Cupboard. The woman at the bank said it would take time to find the parcel and get it to the counter. She asked him to come back later. Fine, began Omri's father, but Omri interrupted. If we went away for, say, half an hour and then came back, would you have it ready? He asked. Omri, they're busy. We could easily. I want it today, Dad, his father shrugged. The woman smiled and said, That'll be all right. Omri and his dad walked out into the village square. There was a sort of little house, just a roof on 4 stone pillars in the middle, where you could sit. This was nicknamed Georgina, after the woman whose memorial it was. They brought ice creams and went and sat in Georgina. Omri's father was in a thoughtful mood. I'm not trying to pry, Omri. You know that's not my style. But, well, where did you get to on Sunday, for instance? You never even showed up for lunch. I told you, Dad, I went to talk to the old Thatcher. For 3 hours? Yeah, well, he was very interesting. You said so. I think all craftsmen are interesting. They're not necessarily 3 hours worth of interesting, though, unless you're in their line of business. Omri said nothing. The urge was coming over him. His father was very special to him. It was true he didn't pry, unlike his mother, who quite frankly couldn't keep her mouth shut. You could trust him with anything, almost. It would be so wonderful, such a relief to tell his father everything and get his advice. But quite suddenly, Omri knew what advice he would give on the present matter. He could hear him saying, Leave well alone, Omri. There's absolutely no reason to bring these people to life except curiosity. Think of all the problems you've had in the past. Think of the damage you've caused. People have died because you meddled. Haven't you learned anything from all that? I know it's a temptation, but leave well alone, why don't you? Excuse me. Omri bit his lips, clamping back the words that would unstopper the source of the secret and let it all pour out of him. Perhaps he could just tell about the notebook. He made a lightning review of its contents. No, hopeless. It gave the whole game away. His father would put 2 and 2 together with the time Mr. Johnson, just before the big storm, brought Omri home from school and announced to his parents and to Patrick's mother that he'd seen 2 miniature people with his own eyes. Then the roof had literally fallen in, and Mr. Johnson went a bit balmy after a branch hit him on the head, and obviously nobody thought about the business of the little people again. But just as Omri's prize-winning story had made Mr. Johnson realize that he hadn't been imagining things, so Jessica Charlotte's story might cast a new light on Mr. Johnson's. That, and the cupboard, and the key, and all the funny goings-on Omri's father must have noticed last year and the year before, and not thought too much about then. Now he would. It would all make sense, well, a sort of crazy sense. He would begin to believe it, and Omri might just as well forget about secrecy. It would all come out. Well, and why not? It was all over now. No, it wasn't, because he wasn't going to take the advice his father would certainly have given him, if he had told, and if, a big if, could have convinced him it was all true. He couldn't. He was going to break his own strict promise to himself and get out the key and the cupboard and start it all up again. Not with Little Bear, Boone, and the others, of course not. They'd been through quite enough, thanks to the magic. But just to see what was in the cash box, just to finish the story. Half an hour seemed to Omri to stretch to eternity, but at last it was time. The woman at the bank raised one of the grills and handed Omri the big oblong parcel, carefully wrapped in brown paper, flaps stuck down with brown sticky tape, and the whole tied tightly with string. You certainly didn't mean anyone to have a sly peep, I see, his father remarked as he signed a receipt. Omri was holding the paper swathed cupboard in his arms. Even wrapped, it had a magic feel to it. He couldn't have explained what a huge wave of excitement washed over him as he felt it again in his possession. He wondered, fleetingly, if people who did drugs felt like this. He felt it wasn't good to be so hung up on something, to get such a charge from it, to be dependent, to be unable to resist what you knew you shouldn't do. That's part of the bad part of the magic, he thought. Frederick's part, his obsession. But realizing this didn't stop him feeling the way he felt as they walked out of the bank to the car. That he couldn't wait to be alone with it, make it work again. They drove home in silence. Omri held the parcel on his knee. He didn't realize he was tapping impatiently on the top of it with his fingernail, making a muffled metallic clicking until his father suddenly said, "I know what it is." Omri froze. "I must be stupid," said his father. "The shape alone, I recognize it. It's that cupboard you wrote the story about, the one Guillaume gave you for your birthday 2 years ago." Omri's mouth went dry. He couldn't have spoken even if he had anything useful to say. His father's profile was frowning. Omri could almost hear his brain ticking away, working things out. That accursed story, The Plastic Indian. Omri had written the whole thing for a competition. They'd all read it. He'd received a prize for it. It was the story that had triggered a memory in Mr. Johnson's brain and convinced him, at least, that he had really seen. It convinced him at last that he'd really seen Little Baron Boone in Patrick's hand that day. Could the fact that Omri had done something as solemn as putting the cupboard as easily recognizable in its wrappings, could he see that now? Could the fact that Omri had done something as solemn as putting the cupboard easily recognizable in its wrappings, he could see that now, into the bank vault tip his father off in the same way that his prize-winning story was based on the truth? But no, even though his father was an artist, he was basically a rational man who automatically rejected anything his senses didn't tell him was true. He, unlike Mr. Johnson, had never seen the little people. Omri saw his father shake himself free of his incredible thought, take a deep breath, and begin to whistle carelessly. He had put it away from him. Omri sighed too, and held the parcel closer. As soon as they got home, Omri bolted into the house, up to his room, through Guillaume's, fortunately empty. He and Tony had gone down to the river, where he blocked the door and tore the wrappings off like a madman. The decent thing would be to wait for Patrick, but he couldn't. He couldn't wait. The excitement was rising to a new pitch inside him. The cupboard, white and shiny, with its new mirror and coat of paint, stood in the wreckage of the brown paper, looking somehow like a tiny building, rising out of mounds of rubble and earth. Omri opened the door, ran his hand over the shelf, and then reached into the bottom and reverently picked up the envelope in which he had sealed the key. He tore it open and drew the key out by its twisted and faded bit of red satin. He could see now that it was not silver, but lead. It was too heavy to be silver, and lead was soft, and the sticking out bits of the key that actually worked the locks were getting a bit worn. As he examined them, it occurred to Omri that lead was the wrong metal to make a key from, if one used it too often, but on the other hand, perhaps its softness, its flexibility was why it worked on a lot of different locks. Or was that just the magic? Would it work on the cash box? Omri fetched it from under his bed. It had got a little dusty. He rubbed it shiny with a stray sock. It was painted black, with gold and red lines, and the red blob of sealing wax in the middle of the lid gave it a bizarre look. Now, thought Omri. He felt breathless with suspense. I must act quickly. Lid up at once. Ignore the earrings. Just go for the little people in their wrappings. Who will they be? How will they be? And a vagrant memory of a line of an old film he'd seen quite recently on TV came back to him. Buried how long? It was said to an old man in a prison cell. He'd forgotten his answer, but it wasn't 30 years. Of course they hadn't been buried. They'd been living their lives somewhere else, but 30 years, it was a long time. No good thinking anymore. If you're going to do it, do it. He put the key in the lock and turned it. The lid sprang open. And that's the end of chapter 14.